Hi everyone, Dr. Monette here to talk to you about adolescent social emotional development. So, to get us started, adolescence is a transition period. It's a really big time for physical and psychological development, primarily because this is the age range where puberty is happening and where adolescents are becoming legal adults. And this period of adolescence is very much closely associated with the teenage years and the cultural expressions that begin. So, a lot of things are happening, especially with them trying to figure out who they are as individuals. So, adolescence, again, is this period between childhood, so they're no longer considered children, and they're not adults yet. And in this time, they're in what Erickson calls the identity versus role confusion stage. And during this time, the biggest thing is this determination of who I am as a person. So, adolescents are always asking, who am I? Who do I fit in with? And who am I going to be? So they're trying to find this identity and they're trying to do this identity achievement, which is reached through the selective figuring out of who they've been through childhood and who they want to continue to be and what they want to change about themselves as they go into adulthood. So adolescents must achieve their identity in occupation, so, what's their job? What major would they like to be? How would they would like to contribute to society? Their sexual roles, their political roles, and their religious roles as well. So, this search for identity is one of the biggest things in adolescence. So, they're always trying to figure out, who am I? And since they can think more abstractly about themselves and about the future, this is why this stage only really starts occurring during adolescence, because they can honestly focus on themselves and all these other contexts that are surrounding them, such as their choices, their values, their appearance, their family, their interest. Becoming sexually active is another part of searching for their identity. So they're starting to behave more like adults. They're starting to have these romantic relationships. They're considering their occupational goals and their religion. And all of this motivates them into who they are and who they would like to be. So Erickson, like I said, he called this crisis, or this crises, the identity versus role confusion. And they resolve this crisis by trying out different roles or possible selves. And they explore the possibilities of displaying these different selves in these different groups to see what works. So during this stage, you may see a lot of adolescents changing their appearance on the outside before they change themselves on the inside. So it may be with their clothing or getting a piercing or getting a tattoo or changing their hair color. A lot of it at the beginning starts that way. And there's nothing wrong with expressing themselves that way. But the internal self is still trying to figure out who they are and what they want to do. It's a lot easier to show the outward expression than it is the inward. So what I want you to do is I want you to watch this video in just a second, and I want you to think about how this adolescent is in this Erickson stage of identity versus role confusion. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about what she is going through and how she overcomes her identity versus role confusion crisis. So, with identity, we have to talk about James Marcia. And James Marcia expanded on Erickson's theory by focusing on exploration and commitment. So, Erickson says that adolescents are focused on this who am I? And then Marcia says, well, this who am I crisis is based off of how much they explore and then the commitment they make based off of this exploration of all these different things that they could be. So exploration, it refers to the process that adolescents use to consider alternatives to who they can be. And then commitment refers to them making a choice based off of this exploration process. And Marcia created 4 categories that occur during the exploration and commitment stages. And for most people, all of these happen at one time. However, they happen in different stages, but for some people, they get stuck in a certain stage or a certain category. So going across the top right here is your exploration. Now, to have a low exploration, that means you're not really looking for all the possibilities or all the alternatives that you could do. Whereas high means that you're really thinking abstractly, what do I want to do with my life? What do I want to be? So low exploration would be, I'm not really thinking about it. And then high would be, I'm really exploring all these different options of what I want to do. Now, commitment, low means, I don't really want to commit to anything. I don't really know what I want to do. And then high is, I know what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it. So for closure, this would be where you have not really explored things, but you have a really high commitment to it. So for closure is, I've made a choice without thinking. A lot of times for adolescents, this may be going to college or joining the armed forces or going into the job force or even dropping out of high school. So I've made this choice. I'm not quite sure why I made this choice, but I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it regardless. But they haven't quite really thought of all their options to see if there's another way about it. Now, identity achievement, on the other hand, this is where you've explored a lot. You've explored a lot. And you have high commitment. So you've checked out all your options. You've seen all these selves, all these alternatives, and you now know what you want to do. So identity achievement, I've thought about it, and I now know what I should do with my life. We want to try to get to this quadrant in Marcia's categories. However, some of us don't get there depending on our commitment levels and our exploration. This is having both. So I've really explored my options and I've made my decision based off of my research and my exploration. Now, identity diffusion, this is where you really haven't checked out all your options or your alternatives, but you have a low commitment. So identity diffusion, I don't know what I don't know, and I don't care what I'm supposed to do. I just don't know. I'm just going to go with the flow. I don't know what I'm going to do. So there's no commitment because there's no goal, and there hasn't been any exploration. Whereas for closure, on the other hand, I've made a choice without thinking. A lot of times with foreclosure, this could be somebody, for instance, they're going to college and their parents tell them, well, you should be a nurse. Well, okay, I'm going to be a nurse. I'm highly committed to being a nurse. My mom told me I should be a nurse, but I really haven't looked into what all is involved with being a nurse. So they have a high commitment, but they have a low exploration. But they may have an issue later when they get to nursing school and they realize they have to see blood and they have to clean up things. And they're like, oh, I don't do blood. Well, they kind of made that decision without thinking. Whereas identity diffusion, they haven't explored anything. They have no clue and no commitment. Now, moratorium, on the other hand, this is, I'm thinking about what I should do. Now, everyone at one point in time might have been in moratorium where they're thinking, they don't know, they're just thinking about it. So I may want to be a nurse, I may want to be a teacher, I may want to be a police officer, I don't know, but I'm looking into it. But if you're always thinking about it, you never make a commitment. So we want to start moratorium with the thinking, but we want to move towards this identity achievement where you've thought about it, but now I've made a choice. Whereas this one is, I've made a choice, but I haven't explored anything. I never did the moratorium part. And then identity diffusion, you haven't done any of it. There's no commitment and there's no exploration. So who are you? I'm going to ask you this question. Well, who you are now is not who you will be in the future. Identity development is a lifelong process. So for me, when I was your age, I was a student, I was a sister, I was a daughter, I was an aunt. But now I'm so much more than that. So if I was to explain who I am now, I am a mother now. I'm a wife. I'm still a student, but I'm a teacher and I'm a learner. And I'm all these different things of who I am. And that's just a little snapshot because who we are as people is a very, very complex and diverse thing. And depending on what hat or how we're performing, because for instance, now I'm performing teacher. But when I'm talking with my family, I'm going to be a completely different identity. Or when I'm with my friends, I'm going to be in a completely different identity role. So, also knowing how to flip identities with the performativity, but it's a lifelong process. So, self esteem and self concept. So, how do adolescents think of themselves or themselves? Well, they think about themselves in conflicting ways. They're very abstract thinkers. So if we go back to Piaget, they can think abstractly, hypothetically. So they're very much thinking about how they see themselves, but also how other people may see them as well. So it's not uncommon for adolescents to conflict based off of what they say. So example, at school I'm pretty intelligent. I get better grades than most. And then they could flip and say, I'm really stupid. I act really dumb and say really stupid things. Well, you just got done saying you're intelligent, but now you're stupid. So going back and forth between that, and adolescents are very hard on themselves, primarily because of that self esteem where they're trying to get that affirmation from their peers. So, adolescence and self esteem. Self esteem, again, it is subjective and it's evaluative, and it's based off of feedback from other people. So, things like school achievement, popularity, does filter into their self esteem. So, if they make good grades, they may feel better about themselves. And if they're popular, they may feel better about themselves. And in adolescence, a positive self regard is generally thought to protect them against negative outcomes. So, if they have a positive sense of self, typically it's thought of that they're not going to fail school, they're not going to drop out, they're not going to be delinquent, they're going to be happy. However, there are some exceptions to that because depending on how they're popular or how they do school achievement wise. Because some people, to keep that self esteem and to feel good about themselves, they'll take medication to keep themselves up at night or to focus. Same thing with popularity. They may drink or drug abuse and things like that. But self esteem really ties into where do I fit in with my friends? How do I fit in with what's going on? And how can I be successful with who I want to be as a person? Gender identity is another big thing that does come stronger in adolescence. So, gender identity is defined as being male or female and the beliefs that one holds about gender roles and attributes. So, gender isn't just this, it also is part of the roles and the attributes that go along with this. It is also an important part of someone's self concept and self esteem. And as we know from the early childhood video, like a girl. When we hear something like a girl, most of us don't take that in a positive way. But when did being like a girl become a negative thing? Well, it goes with those gender roles and those attributes and those characteristics of what it means to be a girl. However, being a girl is not a bad thing, just like being a male is not a bad thing. It's all in how we perceive and how we're shown. So at this age, gender is still defined by physical appearance and what sex you hang out with. Physical appearance is a major role in gender identity. So at this age, what peers see on the outside does play a big part of gender identity. So again, during adolescence, this is where people may dress a little bit differently. You may have some girls that perform girl by wearing dresses, and some don't perform that way. Doesn't mean that they're any less of a girl. They just choose how to portray girl. Sexual orientation is another thing. So as puberty hits, so does that sexual desire and those romantic relationships. So sexual orientation, this is defined as one's preference in sexual partners. There are two main types. However, as we know today, there are a lot of others as well. We have our heterosexual, and hetero means mixed. So someone that is attracted to the opposite sex, mixed sexes. And then homo means same, and that's someone that's attracted to the same sex. Now, in adolescence, the gays and lesbians or homosexual relations usually have had heterosexual experiences before their homosexual experiences. And in adolescence, most teens have started to have sexual experiences regardless of their gender identity. Now, again, this is all based off of experience and exposure, based off of what is considered acceptable or not acceptable in their Bronfenbrenner context. So there are a lot of different things that do impact sexual orientation. Now, sexual orientations as well. Sexual attraction does begin to emerge around age 9, and that's typically 4th grade, and it's more of a progress than an event. It all of a sudden you just don't, it's a progression over time as you go into adolescence. And it does vary by sex and by culture. Girls, again, sexually mature earlier than boys. And also how the culture of where the adolescent and the child grows up also plays a fact. So if they're always talking about having a boyfriend or a girlfriend, they may think that's something that they should have as well. So they may start earlier. Now, experience with sexual orientation, between 5 and 13% of the population considers themselves homosexual. And some individuals do hide their preferences because they're afraid they're going to be ostracized or victimized at school. So a lot of times now in schools or in workplaces, we have safe spaces to where they can go and they may express themselves right away, depending on if they have positive experiences or based off of their Erickson, their crises. They may come out and be fine with it, whereas others may decide to keep it to themselves a little bit more. But there are lots and lots of different identities as well, besides just the homosexual and the heterosexual. Now, regardless of sexual orientation, they have the same needs and concerns as all teens, and they can benefit from supportive family and participation in support groups. And support groups are not just for homosexual relationships. These are also participation in health classes and sex ed classes to explain what's going on and why they may have a certain preference. So there's lots and lots of different types today. Now, things like asexual is also a thing that's showing up. So the LGBTQ, and there's more letters being added to that as new sexual orientations go. But there are some that do not have a preference to genders. Or it may be more on their physical characteristics or the emotional characteristics of all genders. There's so many different types because it's all based off of that belonging and that connectedness that you feel with an individual. Ethnic identity is another thing that does become a big factor in adolescence as well. And this is defined as one's sense of belonging to a certain ethnic group. Now, by adolescence, most teens have a good sense of what ethnic group they belong to. Now, when they were younger, they were learning that there were differences among people. However, ethnicity is more than just race. Race deals with those physical characteristics that can be seen, such as skin color, hair, eye color, things like that. Ethnicity goes a little bit further. So that goes into where you were born, what language you speak, what religion you are. And in adolescence, as a lot of us know, the clique groups do start coming into, they really start emerging because that who am I and who do I fit in with becomes a big deal at this age. So in high schools, you'll see groups that get together based off of those characteristics. And you could see that also in the video that you watched earlier, how everybody with the different masks. However, there was one girl in particular, she switched masks as she was going to and from groups. So she may have identified with more than one ethnic identity group. So she was changing her performativity as she moved from group to group. So relationships with peers. As we know, during adolescence, relationship with peers becomes a priority. So adolescents spend an increasing amount of time with peers, and these peers are an important source of their social and emotional support. They look to their peers to see what to do. They're using them as vicarious models. So going back to Bandura and they're looking at what their peers do, seeing if they're accepted or rejected, and emulating or not emulating those actions. Now, with that, parents often worry about the influence that peers have on their teenagers. So they always want their children to be around positive role models. However, not always the case. So they have to be aware of what's going on and also what's going on with their children. So how does peer pressure work? Well, adolescents, as we know, their brain is not fully developed. They're still waiting on that part, that prefrontal cortex, which is at the front of their brain that doesn't develop until about age 25. And that part of the brain really focuses on risk-taking, and it's also one of the reasons why adolescents are so susceptible to peer pressure. So there's two processes that really focus on why peer pressure works. The first one is selection. And selection is the process that adolescents choose friends. Now, they target friends who have similar traits to them. So, again, that question that Erikson keeps bringing up is, who am I? That's part of their crises. So, identity versus role confusion. So, they find people that they believe are like them and peers they would like to be like or to emulate. So, selection is first off of who they feel like they have the most in common with. Then from there, socialization happens, which is the second key process. And that's the attitudes and the behaviors that are modeled and reinforced. Now, with that, the group, even though they may have commonalities, common traits and characteristics, they may have certain attitudes and behaviors that will be emulated or will not be emulated. Again, it really depends on the reinforcement that they get. So if the group all wants to do something, the one person who doesn't would be more likely to go along with it because everybody else is doing it. So what the model behavior would be, everybody's doing it, and the reinforcement is, well, if everybody's doing it, then they're getting their positive reinforcement from their peer group. Whereas if you say, no, I'm not going to do it, then the model behavior would be that you aren't acceptable and you would have more of a negative consequence instead of a positive. So peer pressure is the strongest during early and middle adolescence, when teenagers really are trying to establish their identities separate from their parents. Before then, they were still more of a family, focusing on their family and what their family does, but now adolescents are finding out who they are as individual people. So, friendships during this age. Well, teenagers view friends as the most important resource outside of their family. They are more out to go and talk to a friend than they are their family, depending on the parenting style of their parents. Also, poor quality friendships can lead to loneliness and desperation. High quality friendships are more supportive. And rejected peers often drop out because they feel like they don't belong, or they may commit crimes or be involved with groups that do more delinquent type behavior because that's who they see themselves fitting in with. And again, going back to Erikson, it's all about who am I and where do I fit in? So identity versus role confusion. Now, adolescent friends Emphasize, cooperate, trust, respect, and resolve their conflicts. So, to have a high quality friendship, being able to talk and cooperate, even agree to disagree, is a very important concept. Again, this is all based off of environment and what they've seen because people learn behaviors from what they see. So, vicarious learning again. Now, typically by gender, not always, depending on the gender, girl friendships tend to be shorter and more emotionally intense. Girls typically have their feelings hurt more when a peer doesn't want to be around them. Again, girls are more out to relationally bully as well. So, pushing somebody out of the group, that would be a more emotionally intense thing. Now, boys, on the other hand, they focus on shared activities. So, even though they may not get along with the person anymore, they still have that shared common ground. Now, also with this, especially in our day and age, technology is a very important part when it comes to peers. Social networking is a critical element of the teen experience. They update, they publish on many, many different social networks, and they're connected to their phone in many different ways. They feel that their friends are in their phone, whereas a couple of years ago, phones were not as, well, a couple of decades ago, phones weren't as prominent as they are today, and it was more face-to-face social interactions, whereas today it's more what's going on with my friends on the internet, what's going on, what are they posting, where are they at, what are they eating, what's going on. Now, not that that's a bad thing. They're very connected to their peers. However, a lot of these friendships that they think they have are not those high quality friendships. They're more of acquaintance friendships. So, making sure that peers know the difference between that, and especially adolescents know the difference between who is my friend and who is an acquaintance, is a very big deal. Now, also with technology, cyberbullying has become very prominent. A long time ago, bullying would stop when you got on the school bus and you came home. Now it's carried over into the home environment because cell phones are 24 hours, social media is 24 hours. So the bully has 24 7 days a week access into your life. And cyberbullying in general is just public online humiliation or harassment. Especially with our culture today, with things like trolling the internet, posting whatever we want in comments, making things anonymous, really give bullies this power in cyberspace. However, there's been lots of laws and lots of things in place to be able to track down cyberbullies. Now, one main reason for that is because the victims avoid the bullies, or the bully is not in the face of the victim. So they feel like it's a indirect way of bullying. So you're there, but you don't really see the emotional effect that you're having on that person. Whereas if you were to say something to somebody's face and they started crying, you may stop. But the bullies can't see past the screen. So there is an avoidance of the presence. Also, the victims don't know who the bully is at all times. So the message can get out to a large amount of people. It's in the digi world, so everybody can see it. And anything you post on the internet stays there forever. It is there. It has a digital footprint. And if you went and you Googled yourself, you would see some photos of yourself that you may not even realize are still out there on the internet today. Especially if you started your Facebook account when you were like in 6th grade. The things you would post when you were in 6th grade compared to what you would post now are completely different. Now you have a little bit more moral and formal operational thinking, and you would go, well, if a future job prospect looked me up on the internet, what would they see? So there's a lot of things about the internet that can be positive. So they can reach out to people all over the world. They can find connections in Facebook groups with people that are like them. It can help them find identity. However, it does open them to a wide variety of people that they would not have normally had in their systems. Now, sexting is another thing that is very prominent at this age, and that's anything that's a sexually explicit text or a photo. Now, there are large percentages of teens that are involved in sexting. Now, sexting in general, it's not a new concept. People have been taking photos and sending explicit notes and messages for a long time. However, now with it being in the digispace, again, once you post something on the internet, it's there forever. And people can airdrop it, people can email it, people can post it, they can change your face and put your face on a certain body. They can do all sorts of things. And again, a lot of legal things have come um, to surface among these. So, a lot of federal and state child porn laws apply to these things. So, especially depending on the age of the couple, there may be a younger and an older. They can get in a lot of trouble for things like this. And again, adolescents are feeling these emotions for the first time. So, they want that loving and sexual relationship, but they don't realize that once, maybe if the couple breaks up, what can really happen with those photos. They don't just go away. So, making sure that peers and adolescents really understand technology and understanding who you can trust and what you should post is a big deal at this age. So, romantic relationships. Romantic relationships, again, girls do mature a little bit quicker than boys do. So, typically, girls start dating earlier, about ages 12 to 13, which is about 6th grade, 7th grade, so middle school, than boys do. And early romances contribute to more conflict and mood swings. Now, that's because, again, socially, emotionally, being able to handle those concepts, such as breaking up, having disagreements, having sexual relationships, having intimacy with somebody, all of those things can have a lot of issues later on, whereas as you get older, you're more mature to be able to handle those situations. Now, girls focus more on closeness and communication, and they do report having more conflicting feelings about sex, especially with if there isn't that communication and that closeness. Now, boys, on average, again, these are more like statistics, focus on physical attractiveness and sexual aspects. Whereas girls, again, focus more on the communication. And it's pretty typical when you watch sitcoms and stuff and the woman saying, "You never listened to me," and the guy's going, blah, 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 type thing. We see that in our culture. So these are common things. Now, again, with this, girls and boys do have different expectations of romantic relationships. And there is also a sexual double standard where it's acceptable for boys to have sexual freedom with fewer consequences, but when a girl does it, it's a little bit different. So again, that gender binary stereotypical thing is very important to talk about at this age. Also, current studies, there are few differences between the attitudes about sex and relationships among boys and girls. And sexual minority youth also, same-sex relationships begin later in adolescence. So there's all these different things that are happening. Now, a couple of little differences here as well. So girls, again, they focus more on the intimacy of the relationship, and they're more likely to have their first sexual experience in the context of an emotional relationship. Whereas guys emphasize physical gratification over intimacy in early sexual encounters. And they oftentimes, not always, view their sexual experiences as conquest, status, and recreation. And again, if we go back and watch a lot of movies about adolescents, the guys are in the locker room and they're talking about it and they're bragging and all of these things. And then you go and you flip to the girl side and they're more keeping it quiet or just telling just their friends. And it's not as big of a conquest or a gratification. Now, influences on romance. Well, first off, culture and romance is a big deal to talk about. Now, first sexual encounters, by statistics and by studies, are earlier for African American youth than Caucasian Americans or their Latinos peers. And Islamic tradition, they have fewer opportunities for dating and they're more closely monitored. So when we start talking about culture and the upbringing of the children, Some families allow their children to date a lot earlier, and then some make them wait. Now, the influence of the parents has a big deal. So, a balance between being permissive and overly controlling. So, permissive would be letting your child do whatever they want. Overly controlling would be you can't date till you're married type thing. And the parents, ideally, parents and teens should talk about dating and romance. However, a lot of parents have some issues with doing things like that because they don't feel comfortable or they don't know where to start or their teen may be embarrassed about it. So a lot of schools have really brought forth sexual education training. They even have classes. There's lots of, even YouTube today, they have informational videos that talk about this. So there's all sorts of things out there. But again, if children don't know and the parents aren't talking about it, they're going to go and talk to their friends about it. And again, as we remember when we were talking about cognitive development, friends don't always know as well. And sometimes it's, I'm going to tell you this to see what happens to you, to see if it's going to work with, or it's going to be good for me. Now, sexual active peers also may encourage sexual activity. So if they go to a peer that is sexually mature compared to their experiences, they may make it like it's not a big deal and things like that. So with that, again, we have to talk about teenage parenting because that is a big part of social emotional as well. So there are teen pregnancies all over the world. And in the U.S., still, there are lots of teen pregnancies. However, as we've heard from a lot of commercials, teen pregnancy is avoidable if children and teenagers are educated about what causes pregnancy, talking about sex, talking about relationships. So there are a lot of negative outcomes of this. Well, if you have a child when you're a teenager or a child yourself, low educational attainment, it's hard to go to school and raise a child. Limited job opportunities. Well, it's hard to get a good job and not have a high school diploma or even post-secondary degree of some sort or training. Economic disadvantage, psychological problems, social stigma, people looking at you in a certain way and thinking that you're irresponsible. Not always the case. And teen parents need a lot of academic and social support. Again, depending on the district, depending on the funding of the schools, some schools have daycares in place. Some parents can help. There's a lot of different things. There's a lot of organizations that can help watch the children so that teenagers can go to school. But again, they have to have access to it and know about them. And a lot of these things are kind of taboo, and we don't really talk about them very much. And especially with today, talking about things like abortion, because less than 3% of teenage mothers choose to place their children up for adoption. And with all the different things all the different means when it comes to being pregnant today, there's lots of different options. Birth control, there's tons of those that are free. And then you have adoption and then you have abortion, but which way is the easiest way or which way is the right way for them? And talking about things like Planned Parenthood, very important things to discuss. So parenting an adolescent. Well, to an adolescent, we all know this, there is nothing in the world more embarrassing than a parent. Well, parenting an adolescence is a time that parents, first off, are the most nervous about. They always think back to when you were little and I could help you and make everything better, but now you're becoming an adult and making your own choices. And I have to let you grow and to understand. So adolescence brings with it a rapid and remarkable growth in many different ways. Physically, you're growing into your adult body. Cognitively, you're growing into your adult cognitive mind. Your brain is developing and getting even more stronger with your formal and complex thinking. And then your social part, you're starting to want your own life and own relationships. So some significant changes during this time is that parents want you to feel close to them and respect them as authority figures, even though you may think that you're an adult and don't need them anymore. But again, there's a lot of things that adolescents think they know that they don't know about yet. And a lot of parents have been there and done that. And if they have open communication, they're more out to share that with their child than to try to act like maybe that they're perfect or didn't make mistakes. So there's a lot of conflicts also during this time. A lot of them are mundane things like personal appearance. What can I wear? When can I date? Can I change my curfew? But a lot of the conflicts are not based on core values such as work ethic, religion, academic achievement. So the conflicts are more focused around being out and about and with my friends and becoming my own person. So during this time, you have to redefine the relationship and you have to establish new equilibrium and new knowledge of boundaries. So things have to change. You can't still have them at their 6 o'clock bedtime during adolescence, whereas when they were littler, they needed that. So increased independence, they also need privacy, but within reason. Because, again, privacy on their phones, they could be doing some things that are not appropriate, and they could also be bullied. So there's a fine line between being overprotective and keeping them from growing up and then being permissive. So have to find a balance between it. So it is very difficult to monitor activities and their mobility of where they're going and who they're going with. But again, that open communication and that authoritative parenting style really come into play with that. So there needs to be a balance between their autonomy and the control. So talking about self-control, know where they are and monitor them, but don't be too overbearing. So monitoring and supervision are one of the two things that are hardest during this time because, as we know, adolescents will lie to their parents about where they're going and who they're going with, especially if they feel like their parent doesn't understand. So making sure that you monitor. High monitoring can lead to bad behavior, but it is less likely to lead to bad behavior. If they know that you care and that you're being monitored, they know your expectations, but you have to be able to explain those expectations. So parents expect disclosure, especially when their safety and health things can be affected. But again, talking back and forth is one of the most important things. A lot of parents will monitor phones. They'll monitor all sorts of things. But there has to be a balance between that because if a teen feels like you don't trust them, then it's kind of hard to feel respected when somebody doesn't trust you when you're not doing something wrong. So finding that boundary is really, really important. And there's no one size fits all. It's really finding what works between you and the child, but also making sure the child knows your expectations and why those are expectations. So coping with conflict. Well, one, there is an increase during early and middle, but there's a decline in late, primarily because of the maturity process. And there are 3 patterns of parent-adult conflict. Well, one is frequent squabbles. Now, these are high rate and they're mildly tense conflict. You never let me do anything I want to do, and things like that. And then there's placid, which are rare conflict, and then there are those extreme conflicts, such as a child does something and a parent may kick them out of the house and change their entire life to where they have to. That would be more of an example of that. Now, there isn't really a difference between the sons and the daughters. However, there is a difference between mother and adolescent and father and adolescent relationships. Mother and adolescent relationships are more intense and more conflict does occur. Whereas the father may be a little bit more distant, and the interactions may be more superficial. Now, again, if we go back to popular culture and look at TV shows, this is a classic example with the mother talking to the child and looking at the father and saying, "Will you back me up on this?" And then the father comes in and says, whatever your mother says. This would be an example of that. Now, there are effects of conflict on long term as well. It really depends on how the conflict is managed or resolved, not to the content of it, but more about how it was fixed. And some of these conflicts, depending on the intensity of it, can last for years, even going into adulthood. So, challenges for adolescents. Well, first off, there are tons and tons of changes that are occurring during this time. Also, this is one of the times where the emergence of mental illness does start to occur. Half of the cases of mental illness do appear by age 14. And there's also a lot of biological risk factors that come into play with this as well. So, exposures to toxins, genetic things, head trauma, substance abuse, which are all things that adolescents are confronted with. Also, psychological risk factors, such as abuse and neglect, maladaptive personality traits, and learning disorders. So, these become even more apparent too and can cause the child to doubt who they are as an individual because they don't have the proper support and accommodations. And then some social risk factors as well as conflict with the family, academic failure, and exposure to violence, which are all things that can happen in a system. All these don't happen to everybody, but for some people that they do, and they are extreme challenges for adolescents, especially if they don't have the support to help them overcome them. So, self-control is something that is really, really important during adolescence. And some of us, depending on our upbringing, have more self-control or less self-control. But again, that is a part of your brain that is underdeveloped until about 24 or 25. So, it is difficult for adolescents to plan, set goals, and self-regulate. However, there's lots of guidance in place that can help. So, balancing, monitoring, and showing interest. Adolescents are more out to talk to you if you have a legitimate interest in what it is that they're doing. Also, helping them by scaffolding development and strategies, helping them understand balance. What's too much? Work, school, and athletics? That may be a little bit too much, but maybe you can work on the weekends. Calmness, breathing, determination, confidence, willpower, all these things that can help them with this. And then also ignite high levels of passion for their interests. If they really enjoy something, listen to them and let them understand and explain why they want to do those things. Now, also setting an example by limiting media usage. So if the parents are talking to the child about watching too much TV or being on their phone too much, the parents should be the model for that. They should be the more knowledgeable other and showing that if I'm asking you to do it, you should do it as well. And then working with them to select appropriate TV shows, movies, and games. There are lots of them out there that are not appropriate for different age levels, but being able to understand what is right for their age and what is not. And then encourage alternate entertainment and activities. So if there's something that they really, really want to do, and it's in the middle of the school week, they want to go to the movies with their friends. Instead of just saying no, and then them sneaking out of the house anyway, telling them, well, you can't go tonight because it's a school night and you have a game tomorrow, but you can go on Friday or Saturday, and I'll even drive you. Or you could take the car, depending on their age. So giving them the alternatives. And then also helping them to be critical consumers of the internet. At this age, teenagers are very susceptible, again, to peer pressure and what their peers are posting. And as we know, I saw it on Facebook does not mean that it's true. So being very critical of what they're looking at and what they're seeing is very important. And also what they're sharing, because they can share fake information really, really quickly. So new media and new risk. So there's lots and lots of risk out there. Drugs, alcohol, reckless driving, and all of those. But again, new media making the internet and people at their fingertips 24/7 is a big deal. Being in contact with strangers is a really, really big deal. Going on all those dating sites and then going on a date with somebody without knowing what's going on is a big deal. And then not letting parents know what's going on is also very, very harmful. And also posting things that can harm their future jobs or careers. And again, I just talked to you about that, so I bet a lot of you already went and Googled yourself to see what you would see. And then advertising. Also making sure that they know not to enter in their personal information in exchange for merchandise. A lot of things are too good to be true. Just because it says it's free does not really mean it's free. And if they ask you for information, do not enter it unless you know it's legit. So understanding what is legit and what's not is very, very important so that you're not easily taken advantage of. So during this time, emerging adulthood is imminent. Adolescence will end and you will become an adult. And as you become an adult, there are a lot of things that are going to happen. So, some issues of identity. Well, first off, as you move into adulthood, your relationships that you build are important things because they're going to build into your intimacy versus isolation, which is Erickson's next stage. So you're either going to have intimate relationships with the people that you knew or with new connections, or you're going to go into isolation to where you have trouble establishing those relationships. So a task that is very important is developing intimate relationships, romantic and non-romantic. Find a life partner and start a family are a lot of the things that happen as you emerge into adulthood. Now, failure to do these, like I said, is that inability to trust, share feelings, beliefs, values, and goals. And what happens in adolescence will carry over into the stage, which will, in turn, filter into the next stages. Also, moving into those new responsibilities and being independent. Going from being dependent on parents to independent is a big shift in those social emotional milestones. And also, early adults in society. So, wanting to further your education. A lot of not a lot of adolescents, but a lot of adults now are delaying marriage and childbearing. Some of them have a dependence on parents as well. So going back home after graduation, especially if you cannot find a job or if you want to pay off your student loans and things like that. So things have really started to change. But ultimately, most adults, as they move into this stage, really want to find that responsibility and that independence on their own as they continue to find out who they are as individuals. So, in just a second, I'm going to ask you how the development over adolescence could affect you in your future career. Now, if you really want to work with young children, really focus on their parents and how this could affect how they interact with you, maybe during parent teacher conferences or maybe in the workplace. And then if you want to work with adults, how could some of these things that you learned about adolescence really affect you in your future careers?